Needed any reminding of the mess we're in, it turned out today that last month the country had to borrow £2.5 billion more than was necessary a year ago. So goes the programme of reducing the debt. This morass was created originally by a banking crisis, which has triggered a wholesale loss of affection for banking in its turn. You may perhaps know the feeling if you have a banker in the family. It's not quite up there with being outed for having Radovan Karadzic on your Christmas card list, but the fear and the loathing lingers. A parliamentary commission took evidence from the Chancellor today on what might be done, and Joe Lynham watched.
The 18th century philosopher David Hume said that politicians should think that every man must be supposed a knave. His point was that certain environments or groups create a culture of greed and selfishness that might not otherwise be the case for individuals. He said that as London was rapidly becoming the centre of the banking world with a reputation for honesty and probity, and the motto, dictum meum pactum, my word is my bond. But now that bond has been severely damaged by 21st century greed. None more so than the LIBOR scandal, where bankers willfully manipulated a key interest rate which may have affected even mortgage rates. So an all-powerful commission was established to look at why some bankers behave in such a reckless way and how it can be mitigated. Today they were grilling the man who set up that commission.
And I hope this commission would look at other issues like the standards we expect of the profession and how, for example, in the medical profession or the teaching profession, we expect certain standards, and those standards are administered by the profession often, but how we can create something similar in the banking industry.
But peers and MPs wanted to talk about the actual laws being introduced by the Chancellor aimed at changing banking behaviour, especially ring fencing or the partial separation of banks' high street operations from their speculative investment banking divisions. The Commission was worried that banks could find a way to bore under any ring fence.
There is a very clear objective in the bill, which is that the regulators and the government of the day can continue the provision of core services in the banking industry in the situation in which a bank is failing, and that I would say is an absolutely crucial objective, which, by the way, my predecessor was, found himself unable to deliver.
And the Chancellor, smarting from today's disappointing government borrowing figures, also warned the Commission not to undo many of the reforms which had already been agreed over the past 2 years. Commission grandees didn't like that.
You gave us the job of going over the ground, and I suspect if you were sitting on this side of the table, you probably wouldn't take too kindly to a Chancellor or a government minister saying, I want you to look at that, but I don't want you to look at that, and so on.
Nor, I'm sure you will appreciate, we find it very convincing to be told that we should be wary of unpicking a consensus. Just because something has achieved a consensus doesn't necessarily make it right, and it's our job to take a look at it. You would agree.
The LIBOR scandal over the summer may have been the trigger for this latest probe, but it was only the slithery head of a very long snake. We've seen banks linked to drug cartels and banned Iranian transactions. We've seen telephone number salaries, fired executives with huge payoffs, and bonuses for failure. So, can the culture of greed ever be tamed whilst pursuing a profit?
I think it's very difficult to actually turn knaves back into knights, which is in a sense what we want to do here. We want to reinstill in bankers the sense of public service, the sense that they're providing a service to the community and that they're not just in it purely for the sake of making enormous bonuses or large sums of money.
I think you can. I think that we've been through a period of great excess in the financial markets where the profit motive dominated everything. And clearly things have changed. We've got new regulations, and there's a new mindset out there. And the new CEOs in some of the major banks, one of their first tasks is going to be to introduce a corporate culture which has much higher ethical standards than we've seen in the past.
In order to work as an investment banker in the City of London, you need to be accredited with the FSA to show that you're not a known criminal, etc. But there's no ethical aspect to that license, unlike in the retail banking sector. So if you're selling mortgages or car loans, there's a far higher standard of proof and qualification needed than if you're trading billions of pounds of derivatives or complex financial products, which could bring down an entire bank or even, in some cases, an economy. It took a former derivatives trader, now an incoming Archbishop of Canterbury, to ask what many outside the establishment were thinking.
Well, surely the easiest way to get us lots of small banks is to break up the big ones, but we might come back to that on another occasion.
Despite the decadence of recent years, tough new rules are on their way to rein in bankers and banks. But some things cannot be regulated. The shadow banking sector, which includes hedge funds, is worth a staggering $67 trillion worldwide. $9 trillion of that is in Britain alone. No amount of ethical change could protect the global economy from a collapse of that magnitude.
Coming to us now, chaps. Well, here in the studio now is Sir Evelyn de Rothschild, scion of probably the most famous banking family in the world, with John Moulton of Better Capital, who's also here. And in San Francisco, we have Jennifer Moses, former executive at Goldman Sachs, who's also been director of Agent Provocateur and an advisor to Gordon Brown. Sir Evelyn, what's gone wrong, do you think, with banking?
I personally don't think it's gone wrong. I just think that it got out of gear due to many things. And if you want me to say so, I mean, J.P. Morgan made a speech, or he wasn't alone, to Congress in 1933, explaining to a select committee that bankers had to behave in a correct manner if they were going to carry out their duties. And it's a very interesting speech and something which one should pay attention to. That was 1933.
The question is, the suggestion is that something has happened and it's about motivation.
Well, I think if you take that point, if I may say so, no one has commented on it, but there's one thing that has transparent, and that is technology. Technology has played a huge part in changing people's attitude to banking, in the sense that traders are now quick in reaction. They take views that don't necessarily think through. You had the example of Citicorp, when you had silos, and one silo didn't know what the other silo was doing, and people were taking action. And the other point, which is very important, is that when day-to-day bankers saw that their return was half the return of investment bankers, they decided they should join up and do some of the investment banking work.
John Moulton, what do you think has gone wrong in the way banking works?
I think it became too successful. We ended up with too few large banks, many of them in the UK, of course, owned overseas, which wasn't the situation historically. So you had distant owners, high leverage, and rapidly increasing remuneration as people tried to chase the investment banking model. Things became far more complicated, and actually ethics did take more and more of a back seat.
Jennifer Moses, do you accept that ethics took a lower and lower place in the pecking order?
Well, I think we have to note that there have been financial panics, problems, ethical issues in banking forever. This is a cyclical problem. I'm not convinced there was a golden age in which ethics and banks were perfect. But I think what did happen is we had not just technology, but frankly democratization of credit, so a lot more people had access to credit, and finance became a very, very, very large part of the economy.
Well, now
And
everyone
as a result,
is trying to.
when
Sorry, forgive me cutting
fail,
across you, but everyone is now trying to work out, looking forwards, how do you bring some sense of order, morality, and minimise danger in future? There are all sorts of ideas. There's an idea for a Hippocratic oath for bankers. There's an idea of something like a general medical council for bankers. Are any of these ideas going to work, John Moulton?
I don't think they'll work easily. You need to change the views of the people at the top. You need to change remuneration systems. You need to make sure that the organisations are not so powerful that they encourage the arrogance which enables people to be unethical. We reached a stage where not so many years ago, suddenly bankers became quite aggressive. If you said you weren't going to work with them, they would threaten you they'd work with someone else, or they wouldn't support you. That only arose in a world where there were relatively few banks and they were very powerful.
And the big problem, if you're a taxpayer, is that some of these banks can behave like this, the traders can take all these risks, and they know that they're going to be bailed out by the tax. How do we get to a position where that's never going to happen again?
Well, the word never happen again I think is unlikely, but there'll be hopefully a better system. One of the things that one has to be aware of is the increased amount of cash in bonus forms given to bankers rather than participating in the company in which they worked. So the loyalty factor disappeared, because if you're paid £50,000 a week in cash, and then the next week you're paid by someone else 75,000, you'll depart. But if you have shares in the business you're working in and participation, that is a different way of looking at things, and that is something that should be ruled in very strongly by the authorities.
The Chancellor says we need to get to a position where bad banks can be allowed to fail. How do we get there?
They shouldn't be allowed to fail. It is the question of, I mean, we've had
Why
a failure.
shouldn't they be allowed to fail?
Well, because we should have proper regulation in supervision. The supervision has got to be well done. We've got to pay the supervisors and make them understand what they're
supervision will occasionally fail, whatever we do. We need to just have more and smaller. That's really the point the Archbishop was making it.
OK, he made the point, and the answer came back that, well, we've got ring fencing, so you can still have these big banks, but effectively running separate divisions. Is that going to work?
Why would you bother? You're going to have two operations under a single holding company. The chances of one tunnelling to the other, which is the phrase the Bank of England uses, is quite high. It'll be quite a big regulatory burden stopping them from tunnelling across. If you just make them separate in the first place, you don't need to worry about this ring fencing. One of the things the Chancellor hasn't done is decide where the line actually drops for ring fencing.